Great. I think we can start. Or we're just waiting for some people to come in. We'll start in 1 minute. All right, I think we can start. Hey everyone, welcome to the global webinar on conceptualizing and implementing a national M&E system, Uzbekistan and South Africa, a tale of two countries, perhaps even more if you apply the lessons to other contexts. I'll just start off with some introductions. My name is Adil Shafkat. I am the director for the Agri Hub at SERP, as well as a technical consultant for Clear PCA, the organizers of these global sessions. We are joined today by Ian Goldman and Mokimova Kilola. I'll quickly introduce them as well, and then maybe you can also add to my introductions if I miss anything. So starting off with Ian, he is the president of the International Evaluation Academy, as well as adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, University of Cape Town. Ian has extensive experience in developing M&E systems in a nationwide context and has helped set up the M&E system and entire framework in South Africa, among other things. Next, we can move to Mokimova. Mokimova is the chief inspector. Excuse me, just 1 second. She's the chief inspector of the group for developing important initiatives based on studying advanced foreign experience and ratings at the Agency for Strategic Reforms, ASR, in Uzbekistan. And she's been working with us, the Clear PCA team, to help implement some of our ideas on an M&E system in Uzbekistan for the past several months. So thank you, both of us, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking out the time to start. To join us today and give us some of the benefits of your experience and learnings. So we'll start off with a quick discussion. So just a quick word about the flow of the conversation. We'll start off with a quick discussion on what an M&E system entails in a national context and what that tends to look like, and why that is an important piece in the policy making cycle. Ian will talk about some of those ideas. Next, we'll move on to Mokimova and the unique context of Uzbekistan, specifically where the initiative for reforms is coming from and how that kind of matches the benefits that we can observe from M&E systems that Ian would have talked about in his piece. We'll next jump back to Ian, who will tell us about this M&E system that he helped set up in South Africa, and specifically about the lessons that were gleaned from his work there and how they can be adapted to or applied to the context of Uzbekistan and perhaps other developing countries as well. And lastly, we will talk about the specific initiatives that we have that we're developing in Uzbekistan with Clear PCA and the ASR to basically replicate some of the good points of an M&E system that we saw in South Africa and in other parts of the world as well. That will then be followed up by opening up the floor to questions from the audience and other attendees. And finally, we'll have some concluding remarks by the panelists and myself. And after that, we're pretty much done. So with that, if there's any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have a team that's ready to try to keep you engaged and answer any queries. You can also post your questions to the Q&A part on Zoom. We will attempt to keep an eye on the question answers, the panelists and myself, and if we are able to integrate your questions into our discussion, we will try to do that as well. So with that, over to you, Ian, and maybe you can give us a bit of context about what it is that we talk about when, what we mean when we talk about M&E systems and a national M&E framework.
Thank you. So welcome everybody from my side. So what do we mean by a system, first of all? We use the term loosely. So we're talking about a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism, a complex whole, or a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized scheme or method. And why systems? Because we want things not to be ad hoc, to embed practice, to ensure consistency, to depersonalize processes, to improve effectiveness and efficiency, etc. And one of the sort of challenges for many governments is how to move from fragmented, sometimes ad hoc monitoring and evaluation to monitoring and evaluation systems. And we talk about a system, and this is a quote from Farubo and Sandel: a system exists when evaluations, or in my brackets, or M&E, are no longer commissioned and conducted on an ad hoc basis, but through more permanent arrangements which aim to guarantee in advance the supply of evaluative or monitoring and evaluation information, and at the same time that evidence is put to suitable use. And it's obviously associated with a particular system, with particular political aspects, administrative aspects, involvement of civil society or not, and it's entwined with particular values, practices, formal and informal, and institutions. And M&E systems recognize an ability to provide the evidence, the supply side, the capacity within the system for individuals and institutions to use that information, the demand side, and the role of intermediaries like monitoring and evaluation units who broker the demand and supply of evidence, and sometimes help to co-create that evidence. And that's a sort of knowledge brokering role. And then there are other elements, for example, the parts, for example, within the broader ecosystem. So those providing training, for example, universities, evaluators themselves, advocacy organizations, VOPIs, or other civil society organizations. And in terms of so it's moving from that ad hocness into a structured and systematic process to bring monitoring and evaluation evidence into decision-making. And again, when we're looking at systems, and this is Michael Quinn-Patton's slide, we see the parts are interdependent, so that a change in one part changes all parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There are interconnected relationships. Boundaries are not necessarily cast in stone, they're socially constructed. Perspectives may vary, and there are subsystems that function within the larger systems. And when we think about how monitoring and evaluation fits, and particularly if you think it from a government state perspective, it needs to relate to the main elements of the public management system. So there's the planning part, whether doing long-term planning, short to medium-term planning, spatial planning, etc. There's the public administration side, personnel, performance management systems. There's the financial side, the financial standards, budgets, financial regulations, financial monitoring. And there's the auditing side and the way financial controls, performance information, how interventions are adhering to policy and regulations. And we need to find ways to embed evaluation and monitoring as a management function within these broader functions and systems. And I want to just briefly introduce you to thinking about how we think about this monitoring and evaluation evidence within a policy or program cycle. And this is a cycle that we've developed in South Africa, but run training with in many countries, actually. And the idea is you have an agenda which comes in from the left there, which might be a political agenda. It might be in a political manifesto. It might be from a particular minister. It could be from a particular permanent secretary or director general. And once you know that agenda, you need to then move into a diagnosing stage where you try and understand what's known about the problem, the root causes, what are the options to address it, and then you select whatever intervention, a policy intervention or a program intervention or a project. Ideally, then you'd move into developing the theory of change, you do a design, you do the operational plan, you're in the planning and design quadrant. You then implement it, monitor, review and refine, you're in the output quadrant. And then you would want to see that there are outcomes and impacts that are being achieved. And you need to, through this whole process, have some process where you're getting constant learning and feedback into the process. Now, where does evidence and monitoring and evaluation evidence fit into this? So part of the diagnosing is defining the problem. And there's tools now around problem definition and doing the root cause analysis, which allows us to understand the root causes. And research can really help in understanding those root causes. And there's a type of evaluation, which in South Africa we call diagnostic evaluation, which is really trying to understand the problem, the root causes and options before you design a program or a policy. You can be bringing in community voice in that diagnosing process. You can be doing futures work and modeling. And based on that, you develop a decision about what intervention you're going to follow. And then another tool, in fact, is scenarios. And then you can, if you're going to be doing evaluations or planning, you need that theory of change. You may be developing a log frame with an M&E framework and indicators, the operational plan and activity-based budgeting. And then in monitoring the plan, you've got your monitoring systems, your management systems, the development of your administrative data. And you can be doing implementation evaluations, which are saying, are things going as intended? Does it look like the outcomes are likely to be achieved? And then you can be starting to integrate evaluative thinking into your implementation process. For example, doing workshops which bring together key stakeholders to say, how's it going? What do we need to do differently? What are we learning? And then your administrative data might be giving data on outcomes, like learning outcomes of children. You might be doing outcome evaluations or impact evaluations or economic evaluations. You might be workshopping with stakeholders to look at what is the changes that are happening. So these are different ways through the whole of that policy or program cycle. You're using evidence, much of it monitoring and evaluation evidence, to try and inform the whole management process, the whole way that you're implementing your policies, implementing your programs, implementing your projects. So the monitoring evaluation system needs to think about all of this and how this comes together and how you can deliver this information and how it can be used to inform decision-making. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ian. That was super helpful. I think something to point out here is the one part that was very appealing to me, and I think is important for the audience, is to point out how we typically associate, at least in Pakistan, and I believe to some extent in Uzbekistan as well, that M&E is, or monitoring is usually done on the financial piece, but as you showed in the main elements of public management systems, there's actually a role for it in every single piece of the bigger system for managing a public system. And monitoring financial expenses is just one part of it. It was also fascinating to point out here, and I think it's important for everyone to take this away, that real evaluations can only really be useful and conducted in the right way if you have an underlying theory of change, because without that underlying theory of change, we do not have a benchmark against which to evaluate the success or failure of our programs. So with that, Mikumova, can we move to your discussion on Uzbekistan, please?
Halamdan evine taşındık. Ben çok küçük yaştayken duyarak. Bütün çocukluğum yani neredeyse dünyada doğduğum için diyebilirim.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining for today's seminar or webinar, how we can say it. From the Uzbekistan side, while doing the analysis, we find it out that we don't have any legal special legislations. So the existing normative acts partly concern the functions of planning, categorizing of strategic documents, and these existing policies do not fully consider strategic planning architecture, categorization, and hierarchy, consistency, and quality. We do have 3 parts. For example, in a law of regulative acts, legal acts, we know that there is a categorizations of planning documents, but they are not fully opened. For example, for development strategy of a new Uzbekistan 2022-2026, we see that it's served for a central document with 7 visuals and 100 goals, but there is a problem with the monitoring implementations due to the lack of specific result level indicators, or simply saying the data in our cases. Moreover, we do have the law on the Cabinet of Ministers, and it serves for development and implementation of program for the various industries, and it also form for of strategic planning into the public administrations. Moreover, implementation of strategies, concept, programs, and roadmap is the key area of economic and social development, which is the responsibilities of Cabinet of Ministers. For example, in Uzbekistan Strategy 2030, we do have 5 priority visions with 100 goals against. The strategy is implemented in parallel with the development strategy of 2022 and 2026. Monitoring in this part is doing by NGO Center for Development Strategy. Also, we do have a national sustainable development strategy for 2018 to 2030, and it reflects countries' commitment to UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which currently monitors 16 goals and 126 targets. The monitoring system includes here 190 indicators with 128 of which are published regularly on the Statistics Agency's portal. While analyzing the strategic documents, we find out that the most strategies were adopted in the period of 2070 to 2022, and most of them are accepted in 2019. Also, here we find it out that only majority parts of strategies adopted are for 4 years, and 12 out of the 62 has no timing, which means that we have this fact not only prevent the monitoring of their implementation, but also make their evaluation impossible, since the assessment of the success of the strategy must be checked with the against specific deadlines. Moreover, while analyzing the strategies with the policy cycles, we find it out that monitoring and reporting parts, 27% of these strategies have a monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and only 10% of the analyzed strategies have evaluation part. The key goal of monitoring and evaluation in these strategies is more effective implementations of strategy. Therefore, these mechanisms are necessary and should be introduced as a mandatory element for the strategic planning. Also, while studying the roadmaps and actions plans for these strategies, we found it out that the planned activities are mainly involved the presentations of the normative acts. So, as a solutions, we are systemizing the strategic planning by drafting a decree on priority measures of implementing a strategic planning system. Which include roadmap with a clear priority measures, methodology. Mostly it's not methodology, but mostly the framework of development, coordination, and monitoring the implementations of strategic documents. Also, we clearly defined the hierarchy and relationships of the strategic planning document, set the minimum quality criteria. There is also put main tasks for the structural units for strategic planning, and have a clear role of ACR, Cabinet of Ministers, Minister of Economy and Finance, and other ministries with the clear roles. Here is so there's what was defined at the base for the in Uzbekistan for the system of strategic planning. We defined that there is really like a poor monitoring and evaluation system. So to come up with this, we're also here is there is a data quality issue. Here we find out that data quality issue make it difficult to monitor the key targets, and monitoring here is aimed primarily at achieving specific goals in roadmaps, which find out the systematic problems of monitoring and evaluations. I hope this was clear. If there is any questions, please comment on the chat box, or at the end we will talk about it more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Makimova. That was pretty helpful and very, I think, illustrative of what Ian was talking about at the top of the session, particularly around the difference between fragmented M&E versus a unified M&E system, right? If you look at the sheer breadth of the legislations and strategies that you listed on your slides, there was so many different strategies that are being implemented or being considered for implementation. And then when we went into the details of the strategic planning decree and the lack of M&E capabilities in that particular system, I think that was particularly indicative that, you know, that's just one strategy around strategic planning. And out of all the other 34 strategies that you talked about, each of those has its own challenge when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to different actors having those core capabilities. And of course, not even talking about evaluations yet, right? I'm not sure, Makimova, to what extent well-defined theories of change exist in these strategies. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of context about that as well. That would be interesting, I feel.
While analyzing the strategies, there is no point for the theory of changes, and it was and this, as was mentioned, only 10% of this of the strategies have evaluation part without clear system. Who is doing? Who is coordinating? There is also no units in the ministries in the monitoring and evaluation. There is there is a frequent changes in structure, cause confusion and confusions and instability. So we need to come up with a solid system in M&E in Uzbekistan to clearly guide the ministries, finding out with their roles, with clear roles, who will do in what manner, what will be collected, what kind of data will be collected, and this data will be centralized. It will also lead to the evidence-based approach while coming up with the strategies.
Yeah.
Can I answer the questions, or it was a little?
No, I think right now we don't have questions per se, but thank you for answering my question. That was super helpful. And I think, again, it really serves to link back with what Ian has been talking about. And perhaps, Ian, we can now jump into the system in South Africa. I think one important lesson to take away is obviously the phased nature of these reforms, because clearly when we look at the picture in Uzbekistan, there's so many challenges that are evident and that have been discussed, and not all of them can be addressed simultaneously. So we also have to consider prioritization, I believe, as one of the important considerations here. But of course, having said that, Ian, over to you with the experience in South Africa.
Sorry, just unmuting. So just to give you some feeling about what we've been doing in South Africa. So the focus of our monitoring and evaluation systems has been improving policy or program performance. That, of course, and you know, a key there is providing feedback to program managers to improve the way programs and interventions operate. Another one is around accountability. Where's public spending going? Is the spending making a difference? Improving decision making. Should changes be made? Should things be continued? Should increased budget be allocated? And also building up a knowledge system for knowing what has worked and hasn't worked, and that can be built on as one's making policy decisions going forward. And I'm just going to highlight some of the national M&E systems, which all ministries, provinces, we have a semi-federal system, so we have provinces have to comply with. So one of them is that we have a national development plan, but we also have a set of priority outcomes which are defined as each new government comes in. They varied between 7 and 14 priority outcomes, like health and education, employment, etc. And these have had historically plans against each of these outcomes, and then indicators to be tracked with those. And there used to be 3 monthly tracking initially on that, and then later that was 6 monthly, and these are reported to Cabinet. So Cabinet gets a picture about how these priority outcomes are going. The second one is that each ministry or department has a strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan, which aligns with the period of a government. And then they produce annual plans against that strategic plan, and they have to report quarterly against that. An innovative system which was developed in South Africa following experience actually in Canada was looking at the quality of management practices in individual departments. So there are 41 indicators which are looked at. So, for example, about financial systems, about human resource systems, governance systems, etc., and tracking that the basics are in place and that the departments are undertaking the basics to get their capacity into place. Another system that we developed was unannounced field visits to frontline service sites like clinics, hospitals, police stations, etc. And this was done by the National Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation with the provincial administration. And so then there would be a report done on each of these sites on the quality of services as seen by the clients, as seen by frontline services, photographs taken, for example, of the condition of toilets, looking at the way queues are being managed, things like that. Then there's a system of socioeconomic impact assessment, so that all policies prior to approval have to produce these to look at what the likely impacts are likely to be and to expose when there are systemic problems, which some of these policies are likely to come up with. And that was started by the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, is now run through the presidency. Then there's a unit called Operation Vulindlela, which I also do a bit of work with, which is what's called a delivery unit working on priority reforms. And its job is to try and unblock key reforms which are affecting growth. For example, helping in the switching to renewable energy, trying to address problems in the logistics systems like freight rail, that does a 3-monthly reporting against those. And again, there's reporting to Cabinet on how things go. And that's been a very interesting initiative, which has been very successful, actually. And the Ministry of Planning, in South Africa, we call it a Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, is the custodian for many of these systems and sets the standards, sets the guideline, provides the guidelines, and makes sure that the training happens. And of course, there are other more specific systems which are for particular line ministries. There are local government M&E systems, and there are also social accountability processes, for example, where civil society monitors government. So there are many systems. One of the key systems that we developed was building in the idea of a theory of change, that we had to have a pathway of change where activities would lead to outputs, short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and the impacts that we were looking for. This is just happens to be a theory of change for a grant bursary program, which was trying to get teachers going into rural areas in subjects like maths, where there was a teacher shortage. And it's been very important that getting the idea of theories of change into the system. And we started with this from evaluation, and this ended up then being incorporated into the planning system. I mean, when I talk about all those systems, it can seem a bit overwhelming, but actually the systems have all been developed over time. So, for example, if I just take the evaluation system as an example, in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation was established in 2010, and the monitoring system started to get going quickly. And in early 2010, there was a request to move on evaluation. We did a study tour to Mexico, Colombia, and the US. We drafted the National Evaluation Policy Framework. We started a pilot evaluation because I'm a great believer that there's nothing that's to learn from best than trying things out. And so we built the ship as we sailed rather than trying to get everything sorted out in advance. In November 21, the National Evaluation Policy Framework was approved by ministers. And by 2012, we were developing our first guidelines, the first evaluation completed. We then developed our first national evaluation plan. We started trying to pilot provincial evaluation plans. And in 2014, we started establishing a system where departments would have their own evaluation plans. But these things go up and down. In 2017, there was a change of leadership and attention shifted. The president at the time was actually asked to leave. Lots of problems in government with what we call state capture. In 2018, 2019, a new president came in. Things changed, and in 2020 there was new leadership in the evaluation system, and the system continues. But at the moment, because of the fiscal constraints, it has fewer resources than when I was leading it. So what are some lessons for Uzbekistan and more widely? First, it's important to build national M&E systems. This highlights where the problems are, and evaluations can recommend what can be done to improve things. However, it doesn't solve problems by itself. And one of the issues, the criticisms that we had in South Africa is, well, you're not solving the problems. Well, it wasn't our job to solve the problems. It was our job to highlight what the problems were and how they could be solved. But the politicians had to take the decisions, and senior managers had to take the decisions to make changes happen, whether that's in planning, in budgeting, or how things were implemented. So people can have unrealistic expectations of monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation won't solve the problem. It highlights the problems which decision makers then need to act on. Thirdly, it's a medium to long-term project to build M&E systems. You know, we achieved an awful lot in 3 to 5 years, but overall you're talking of 10 to 20 years to really an impact. But you can do a lot in 3 years. So don't underestimate. It's worth thinking about what you need to do in a short space of time as well. But it needs political support and leadership, particularly for evaluation, because evaluation highlights failure. It highlights what's not working and why it's not working. And many governments are not interested in facing what's not working. They don't have the courage to face what's not working and try and solve it. And this was our minister on the right here, who was very committed. Unfortunately, he was killed in a road accident, but he was a very committed minister, and he was very supportive as we developed the system in the first few years. It needs a driver at the center of government as a champion with the capacity to support the systems. And, you know, for example, if I take DPME, we started with a few people seconded. I was seconded into this new department in 2010, and it's ended up with something like 400 people. You know, different people were, in the end, when I left in 2018, I had 15 staff in the evaluation system, in the evaluation unit rather. And so, for example, if ASR is going to take on many of these roles in Uzbekistan, it's going to need a lot of additional capacity to be able to take on these roles, or in the Ministry of Economy and Finance. To minimize resistance, because M&E creates resistance, you're highlighting problems. People often don't want to face the problems. So to minimize resistance, it's important to build cross-government support for the system and to build a coalition. And so one of the things we did, for example, with evaluation is we built an evaluation technical working group, including different ministries, so that this would not be seen as just the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluations initiative. It's a cross-government initiative to make evaluation work. So it's very important all along to try and think about how you build that cross-government coalition. The other thing is that you don't need to sort everything out on paper before you start. It's important to get some sort of initial concept which directs your action, but then start by prototyping, start by piloting, so you're learning by doing. And for example, that's what we, in the thinking with Uzbekistan, we've been thinking that's the way we should be thinking about evaluations, test out piloting and evaluation. And also, you know, thinking about the decree that Uzbekistan's is developing, using that decree to identify the areas that we would want to start and the areas we might want to work on later. It's important also not to just keep all your eggs in one basket. You need to not just work with the executive, but also work with Parliament, work with the think tanks, work with the media, work with the VOPs, to support and use the system and keep the pressure. And it's very important to ensure that evaluations are made public. So it's part of the public discourse of how we can make things better and improve. But this also means that you have to be very careful, because M&E can become punitive. And if it's punitive and people see that the impact of everything being made public is they get sacked, then the last thing they're going to want to do is make things public. So it's important to build it, to see this as part of a culture shift towards M&E being part of learning, not M&E being punitive. And lastly, I just want to pick up on something that I feel very passionate about, is that we're moving into a stage where climate change is causing a great risk to all our societies. We saw Pakistan, a third of Pakistan flooded. We're seeing, I mean, where I live in near Cape Town, we have an annual rainfall of about 650 millimeters. Well, we've had 3 rainfall bursts of 200 millimeters last September, of 100 millimeters in April, and we've just had about 150 millimeters. So in 3 rainfall bursts, we've had, you know, 2/3 of our whole rainfall for the year. We're moving to difficult times, and not only is the climate an issue, but our economic systems are creating inequality. And so we have to find a way to look for systems that are fit for the future, that support a socially just transition towards climate and ecosystems health and more equal societies. And we've been collaborating through the South African M&E Association with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation to produce criteria and guidelines on that. And you can see the guideline on the right there. And it's very important that as we think about building our M&E systems, we see them as building systems which are helping the social transition we need and are not just perpetuating destructive, unequal systems which are causing the problems in the first place. So with that, thanks very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ian. I believe we have one question in the chat here. So Sama asks, does change in the government or stakeholders have an effect on the implementation of these systems?
Yes, it does. And I mean, I mentioned that there was this transition that happened in 2018 when a new head of department came in who, for example, wasn't very interested in evaluation, and support waned. And it took until 2020. For example, I left in 2018. I was playing 2 roles as a Deputy Director General and Head of Evaluation, and my posts were not filled for 2 years. But then in 2020, they were filled. The head of department changed, there became more support. So we have to see these as long-term projects which go up and down. But this is also where we need to consider, I don't think you should start with legislation, but at a particular point, you need to get legislation in to make it less an option that, you know, a new head of department just says, I don't like this, I'm dropping it, because actually it becomes part of, it's enshrined in legislation. And I think in South Africa, we took too long. In fact, we still don't have any legislation about monitoring and evaluation. And I think, you know, we should have actually been looking for legislation after 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't realize that there still wasn't any legislation in South Africa in spite of a relatively sophisticated M&E system overall. That's incredible. And I think that's a lesson for Uzbekistan, certainly going forward, where obviously one of our priorities has been drafting some, draft legislation around this or supporting that process. So, Mukimova, do you want to just tell us about what is happening in Uzbekistan over the next couple of months and years to come? And then we can kind of complete the conversation. Yeah. And you're on mute, Mukimova.
Do you hear me now? So I'm really sorry. I need to go for the slide here. For the past few months, we are working on a decree with Mr. Ian Goldman. We know that we have a strategy 2030, which highlights the significance of public modernization of public administration through the IT and better data management. Also, we need to attain long-term objectives such as economic growth, prosperity, and increase the citizen participations on it. So, as was mentioned earlier, we do have a fragmented system of M&E. So we need to systemize it for these purposes. So We need to establish legal framework for this by developing the decree for M&A system, which will ensure consistency of working plan with the national goals and objectives, and also operatively response to the dynamic changes in the economy and overall. So the aim of this decree here, the main aim of the decree is to improve the effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability of the government programs and projects. Precisely, we need to, the aim is to improve the program effectiveness by increasing the impact and cost effectiveness of government programs by using M&A data to identify best practices, optimizing resource allocation, and improve program design. As was mentioned earlier by Mr. Goldman, as a lessons for Uzbekistan, so we need to first identify the best practices by piloting. So this is one of the aims, purposes of the decree. Second is inform policy and decision makers it is to offer reliable, timely information for evidence-based policymaking and strategic planning by integrating M&A findings and ensure decision-making makers have access to relevant data. This is where we can see the role of the strategic planning system and the M&A itself. Thirdly, it is a foster culture of learning and adaptation by promoting a culture of continuous improvements by using system findings to adapt policies and programs to build a knowledge-based effective and ineffective practices. First, we need to enhance accountability and transparency. To ensure transparency and accountability in government activities and expenditures by creating clear reporting mechanisms and making the M&A finding publicly accessible, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Goldman. Fifth, it's support sustainable development goals and national priorities. To align M&A activities with sustainable development goals and national priorities by incorporating SDG indicators and national target into M&A framework. As was mentioned in earlier slides, we have a strategy for sustainable development, and the Agency of Statistics have monitored the 190 indicators. So we need to adjust, incorporate these indicators with M&A framework. It will, by using data to track progress and adjust strategy and policies accordingly. And last but not the least, facilitate coordinations and integrations. To improve coordinations of M&A activity across government agency by establishing a central body to harmonize effort, prevent duplications, and ensure coherent data sharing and collaborations. These are the main aims of the decree. So as the solutions, there is a we are preparing together with Mr. Goldman a draft of a decree on approval of the regulations of the procedures for monitoring, reporting, and evaluation, which will have a clear roadmap, framework, and mechanism for understanding monitoring, reporting, and evaluation system, clear roles of ICR cabinet ministers and other government bodies. This decree also set a clear timeline for reporting and the minimum and also define minimum standards for M&A reporting. Also, the procedure for approving M&E documents has been determined. Additional tasks for the structural divisions of strategic planning and methodology together with M&A units are also determined on this decree. Also, this decree instruct to increase the capacity as evaluations and monitoring processes need additional capacity for this. Moreover, it instructs to develop electronic platforms for the monitoring of target indicators. Another one is the creating of a technical cross-government groups, which was earlier mentioned by Mr. Goldman. It's also crucial as the interrelationship with these government bodies will help clearly monitor, track the results of this of the strategy strategy results. This is all for this presentation. If you have any questions, I will be ready for answer for this.
Thank you, Makimova. I think we have a few questions in the chat, but since you just gave us an overview about Uzbekistan, we'll just start with the question that's directed at Uzbekistan, where an attendee asks, while moving towards M&E, how do you deal with HR or capacity issues?
So, on the decree part, we are trying to instruct to build a new capacity for monitoring and evaluation system, and we do have academy for public administrations, which will be where they will be instructed to have trainings for the government workers and increase their knowledge on this program, on this system.
Right. So I think we can summarize that by essentially enhancing the training capacity of the people in Uzbekistan and ultimately prioritizing the kind of capacity that needs to be developed for a successful M&E framework. All right. Thank you so much, Makimova. Ian, I believe we have a couple of questions that are addressed to you. Maybe we can start with the simpler one first, which is, in what ways can the state ensure that M&E systems will not end up being punitive in order to encourage transparency? Because that's a very valid complaint or concern.
It's a great question. I think this is where leadership really is very, very important. Leadership has to show by example. So whether that's the president, whether that's ministers, you've got to show that you are not going to punish people when there's when a mistake is made or things are not working. You might punish people if they don't act to resolve the problem. And I think that's what we need to move towards. And a lot of my job as head of the valuation system was actually, one of my key jobs was to build trust in heads of departments that we were not there to punish them. We were there to improve performance. And once they developed that trust, then suddenly lots of evaluations flowed, even from departments that have been very resistant to doing evaluations. And one of the things that we did to try and help that is we ran a course in evidence, a 2.5-day course for the top 3 levels of the public service in South Africa. And 350 of the top 3 levels of the public service went through that course. And in that, we showed why evidence-based policymaking was very important, and the role of monitoring and evaluation in that, but also research and data, not just M&E. And in that, through that course, in the the opportunity to interact with senior managers and many right across government, we ended up doing many evaluations, critical evaluations. So that's where this is, again, relationships matter hugely, and building that trust is very, very important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and thank you for making that clear. I think this comes back to ultimately, what you were talking about the use of M&E and what the purpose is, right? Rather than being something as a mechanism for punishment or punitive measures, if it's actually used for learning, and then specifically this idea of engaging with the teams that you will be working on, building those relationships, and also educating them about how the system is supposed to work. So all of that together can constitute an effective strategy and help overcome some of these resistances or barriers to adoption. Having said that, of course, having worked in the sector, this is not trivial and it's not easy, and requires very capable people like yourself to actually help achieve this goal. All right, we have one last question from Stefana from Romania, where she says that Romania has a lot of ups and downs when it comes to M&E, with some very good components and projects and a lot of wasted effort. The biggest challenge for cross-institutional strategies is that institutions do not like to collaborate and exchange data, and that the databases are sometimes not even interconnected or compatible with each other. For example, in the education sector, it can be a task for Sisyphus to help the government as a consultant, often contracted on a short-term basis. What should we focus on when we want institutions to work together, but they don't want to do that and they do not collaborate with other types of stakeholders? Very simple question.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Stefano, what a great question. I don't think there is a simple answer to it. I think what we've got to do is part of the, if people, as we get monitoring and evaluation systems going, these sort of problems will come up. And then there has to be enough political will and enough drive from perhaps a central ministry which has got tasked with this to be able to deal with it. Otherwise, it's impossible to deal with it. It is a really big problem. It's a problem in most countries that I've come across. So it's not an easy thing to solve. But as with many other things, as the will increases, these things become possible. It's very difficult to deal with it, though, as a consultant. I mean, I think when you're trying to deal with something like that from the outside, it's extremely difficult. All you can do is try and help the M&E systems to work and expose these problems, and then say, well, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I echo Ian's sentiments here. I have worked as an outsider with different governments in many parts of the world, and this is something that I've seen, happen everywhere. In Pakistan, where I live and work, this is a very common problem. In data systems are not interconnected, and often there is very little collaboration or sharing of information. Some of it because of the reticence around punitive measures, but often there's also some kind of institutional rivalries where different ministries might be competing for scarce funding with each other and do not want to cooperate. So as an outsider, the scope of what we can do is very constrained, and I suppose it comes back to the same ideas of identifying the right type of leaders with whom to collaborate, who can champion some of these initiatives and can really argue the case on a more appropriate forum where they have some kind of power to make a meaningful change. All right, with that, I think we have gone over time. So I'm not sure if we have time for closing remarks, but this was a very, very interesting discussion. And I'd just like to thank Ian and Mokimova for taking the time out to have this conversation with us and letting us know about the important work in South Africa and Uzbekistan that has happened and is happening. And thank you to all the participants as well as the organizers at Clear PCA for organizing such a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.